It was Christmas Eve in Arizona, a town blanketed in the soft, shimmering glow of Christmas lights. Every street seemed alive with the magic of the holiday season. Houses decked out in grand displays of Christmas trees, twinkling lights, and wreaths of red and green. Laughter echoed from every corner, and the cold air carried the sweet scent of gingerbread and pine. But in one small house on the outskirts of town, the lights were dim. The Christmas spirit seemed to have skipped over this home, as if the town's festive cheer had passed them by. Inside, the only light came from a single candle flickering on the worn dining table. The walls were cracked, and the roof had more than one leak. A chill lingered in the air despite the heavy layers of blankets Oliver had wrapped around his children. Oliver, a man of dark skin and quiet strength, stood at the stove stirring a pot of soup. The vegetables in the pot were limp and tired. Their colors faded from the many days they had spent waiting in the corner of the pantry. But Oliver didn't mind. This was all he could afford. His leg, which had been broken in a car accident just a week ago, still ached with every movement. It wasn't the worst injury he'd ever had, but it was one that had taken away his ability to work. The savings he had left went toward paying for his treatment, leaving him with little for anything else. He had tried his best to shield his children from the harsh realities of life, but their eyes were sharp. Lucas and James, his twin boys, were already old enough to understand that things weren't quite the same for them as they were for the other kids in town. Oliver took a deep breath and placed the bowl of soup on the dining table. The familiar, dull scent of old vegetables filled the room, but he didn't want to disappoint them. He had promised to make something for them tonight, though he knew they would have preferred something else. They always did. He walked over to the broken window where his children stood, their small faces pressed against the glass, gazing out at the colorful lights that decorated the streets. Their eyes reflected the brilliance of the houses down the road, houses where the laughter of families seemed to spill into the night. Oliver watched them from behind, his heart sinking. They were so young, so full of hope, but he couldn't give them what they truly wanted. "Come on, boys," he called softly, his voice heavy. "Dinner's ready." With reluctant sighs, Lucas and James stepped away from the window and sat down at the table. They both hesitated for a moment, their eyes glancing one last time at the twinkling lights in the distance before finally settling into their seats. The sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor echoed in the stillness of the room. Oliver noticed how they both seemed to be avoiding looking at their dinner. The soup, which had once been a comforting meal, now seemed to hold little appeal. Lucas, the more outspoken of the two, finally broke the silence. His voice was soft but carried the weight of an unspoken request. "Papa," he said, his tone carefully neutral, We wanted to ask you something." Oliver set down his spoon, his hands shaking slightly. His heart fluttered, knowing that the request was coming. He could feel it in the air. What would it be? What could they possibly ask of him tonight, when there was so little to give? His mind raced. Was it about a toy? A game? A trip somewhere? Oliver tried to keep his face calm, but inside he felt a wave of dread. The last time they had asked for something, it was a simple pair of shoes for school, something so basic and yet so impossible for him to afford. His thoughts briefly wandered to the events of the last week. The accident that had left him with a broken leg, the loss of his job, and the overwhelming pressure of trying to keep his family afloat. He had spent the entire week in pain and frustration, his body aching with every movement, his spirit strained with every passing day, but nothing compared to the guilt that gnawed at him when he saw the hope in his children's eyes. "Papa, James hesitated, his small voice faltering. "We've been thinking." Oliver's chest tightened. The silence that stretched between them felt like an eternity, as if the weight of their unspoken words was pressing down on him. He met their eyes, one after the other. They both looked so serious, so grown up for their age. Their dark eyes, so similar to his own, held a mixture of hope and sadness, a reflection of the very struggles he was facing. "What do you want, boys?" Oliver asked gently, trying to mask the unease in his voice. He forced a smile, though it barely reached his eyes. "You can ask me anything." Lucas exchanged a quick look with James. For a brief moment, Oliver thought they were going to ask for something simple, perhaps a new set of clothes, or a toy they had seen at the store. But then Lucas lowered his gaze to the table and James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's nothing big, Papa," Lucas said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. We don't need a lot. Just something small." James nodded, his fingers twisting nervously in his lap. His small hand clenched into a fist and then relaxed, as if he were trying to gather the courage to speak. "Papa," he said at last, his voice quiet but full of emotion, "all the houses down the street, they're all decorated for Christmas. And we don't have anything, Papa. No tree, no lights." Oliver's breath caught in his throat. He had known this was coming. Of course they had noticed. Of course they wanted a Christmas tree. Every child in the town had one, except for them. I'm sorry, boys," Oliver said, his voice thick with emotion. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he fought to hold them back. I can't give you that this year. I've tried, but there's no money. I'm sorry." There was a long pause, and for a moment Oliver wondered if he had disappointed them too much. His heart broke as he watched the light in their eyes dim, just a little. They didn't speak for a long time, the silence between them stretching out like an unspoken wound. And then Lucas spoke again, his voice barely audible. "It's okay, Papa. We didn't want to make you sad." He paused, looking down at his soup. "We'll just eat. It's fine." James nodded, his lips pressed together in a thin line. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. He understood. They both understood. It wasn't about the tree or the decorations. They just wanted their father to be happy again. They just wanted to see him smile. Oliver swallowed hard. He couldn't bear it. They were so brave, so strong, and yet he knew how deeply they longed for a Christmas just like everyone else. "I'll make it better," Oliver whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure how. He had no idea how he could make this right. But one thing was certain. He would try. For them. He would do anything to give them the Christmas they deserved. As they sat together in silence, Oliver's mind began to work. What could he do? What was left? He had no money, no resources, but he couldn't let this go on. He couldn't let them live with this pain. But he didn't know yet. He didn't know what was coming next. Oliver stood motionless, the weight of his son's words pressing down on him. His heart ached, and for a moment he wondered if his children truly understood the depth of the situation. 2 weeks ago, he had been hit by a car while crossing the street, his right leg shattered, his left arm bruised. The pain was unbearable, and the hospital bills had drained the last of his savings. His children, Lucas and James, had taken turns tending to him while he lay in bed, helping him dress, cook, and even walk. They had been his lifeline during the long, painful recovery. The memory of their tender care made his chest tighten with both love and guilt. How could he explain to them that the world was too heavy to carry alone? How could he explain that he could barely make ends meet, let alone provide them with a Christmas tree? But Lucas's words echoed in his mind, his voice full of innocence and hope. "Papa, the whole town is lit up, but our house's paint is peeling, leaving it colorless. The children in town call us ghosts and mock our house, calling it a haunted mansion. They tease us for being poor. Can't we buy a Christmas tree this Christmas?" Oliver closed his eyes, trying to block out the flood of emotions. His sons, both dark-skinned like him, had already endured enough mockery for their appearance. The town's children had always made cruel comments, calling them names because they didn't look like everyone else, but the teasing had worsened over time. Now, it wasn't just about how they looked, it was about what they didn't have. The Christmas tree, the lights, the feeling of belonging. He swallowed hard. He could still remember the teasing he himself had endured as a young boy. He had come from a poor background, but there had always been warmth at home. His mother had done her best to make Christmas special for him, even if they didn't have much. Yet, here he was, his own children yearning for the simplest joys of the season. He looked at his sons, their bright eyes now filled with expectation. They weren't asking for anything extravagant. They just wanted a tree, like the other kids. Oliver stood silently for a long moment. He could feel the cold air around them, the empty spaces in their home, and the aching emptiness in his wallet. He had spent all his savings on medical bills after the accident. There wasn't a single cent left to spare, but his heart twisted as he thought about what his children had said. How could he deny them this one small thing? "I'm sorry, boys," Oliver finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could make this better for you. I wish I could just walk out and buy you that tree you want. But—" His words trailed off, and he felt a heavy lump rise in his throat. He turned away to hide the tears that had begun to form in his eyes. But then, Lucas spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Papa, you said you would get us a tree. You promise?" Oliver's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his son's hopeful words. Lucas's face was full of trust, and in that moment, Oliver realized just how much they were relying on him. His children had never asked for more than he could give, and now they were simply asking for something they had seen in every other home. The thought of telling them no made him feel like the worst father in the world. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. How could he explain to them that he simply didn't have the means? The words didn't come, and instead he found himself doing something impulsive, something he didn't normally do. He reached out, pulling both Lucas and James into his arms. They froze for a moment, startled, but then both of them melted into his embrace. "I will definitely get you a Christmas tree," Oliver promised, the words leaving his mouth before he could even think them through. The children's faces lit up. Lucas grinned widely, and even James's usual quiet demeanor seemed to soften as he beamed up at his father. "You promise?" Lucas asked again, his voice full of wonder. "I promise," Oliver repeated, though the words felt like a heavy burden now that he had said them aloud. As the boys pulled away and went to grab their spoons, their excitement was palpable. They were talking over each other, excitedly planning how they would decorate the tree once it was up. They dreamed of the lights, the ornaments, and the feeling of their house finally looking like the others in town. For a brief moment, Oliver felt a fleeting sense of relief. Perhaps he had made them happy. Perhaps the promise was enough to satisfy them. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew it wasn't that simple. How would he fulfill his promise? His mind spun, trying to come up with a way to make the impossible happen. There was no way he could afford a Christmas tree, not with the little money he had left. His savings had been wiped out by the accident, and even the small jobs he had managed to pick up since his recovery barely paid for rent and groceries. How could he tell his children the truth without breaking their hearts? Was there any way out of this? As Oliver stood by the window, staring out at the lights in the distance, he found himself lost in thought. He wished more than anything that things could be different. He wanted to provide his children with everything they had ever dreamed of, especially this Christmas. But how could he? A soft whisper escaped his lips as he looked up at the stars outside. What if Santa Claus could come to our rescue? The thought made him laugh bitterly. Santa Claus didn't exist. Not for people like them, not for families like his, but still, the thought lingered in his mind, a strange, desperate hope taking root. What if some miracle could happen? As he turned away from the window, Oliver saw his children, still chattering about the tree, and his heart swelled with a bittersweet emotion. No matter how hard it would be, he would do whatever it took to make this Christmas special for them. He had made them a promise. Oliver spread a thin mat on the cold, splintered floor of the small room. He had no energy left to light the lantern, so the darkness settled around him like a heavy blanket. His head lay back against the mat, and for a moment he allowed the tears to fall freely. The weight of everything, his broken body, his empty wallet, and the promises he couldn't keep, felt unbearable. He shut his eyes, but the images of his past refused to leave. 2 weeks ago, everything had been different. He had been crossing the street when the car hit him. He could still remember the screeching tires, the sudden jolt of impact, and the pain that rushed through his body like wildfire. It had been a miracle that he had survived, but he hadn't come out of it the same. His leg was broken, and for days he could barely move. His world had become the four walls of the hospital room, and through those walls he had heard his children's voices calling for him. They were scared, but they tried to keep hope alive. The next few days had been a blur. Doctors, nurses, pain, and helplessness. His body had been bruised, but it was his heart that had been shattered. He had no choice but to rely on his children for care. They had been his strength, bringing him food and medicine, their small hands gently helping him when he couldn't help himself. After 5 days of rest and recovery, Oliver had finally felt ready to return to work. His legs still ached, but he had to push through. He had to keep his promise to his children. They were depending on him, but the factory wasn't the same. When he arrived, his boss, Mr. Keller, looked him up and down with a cold, uninterested gaze. "I'm sorry, Oliver, but your condition is too much of a liability," Mr. Keller said, barely glancing up from his desk. "We can't afford to keep you on anymore." The words hit Oliver like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud was different. His mind raced as he tried to think of any way to convince Mr. Keller to give him a chance. He had children at home. He had a promise to keep. "Please, Mr. Keller, I can still work," Oliver pleaded, his voice rough. "I need this job. I have kids." "I'm sorry, Oliver," Mr. Keller interrupted, his voice flat. "It's over." Oliver stood frozen for a moment, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His stomach churned, but there was no time for more words. He gathered his things, heart heavy with defeat, and left the factory. The cold wind that hit him outside felt like a slap, and he kept his head down, trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill. When he returned home, the door creaked as he opened it. The silence inside was suffocating. His sons, Lucas and James, were sitting at the table, their faces expectant but weary. They had been waiting for him, hoping that today would be the day he brought home the Christmas tree they had dreamed of. Oliver's heart tightened as he saw them, their eyes wide with hope and longing. He had nothing to give them. "Papa, did you get the tree?" Lucas's voice broke the stillness, light but filled with hope. Oliver's chest constricted. The question felt like a weight pressing down on him, as if it were a reminder of everything he had failed to provide. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was hard to keep up the illusion that everything would be okay. His hands trembled as he slowly took a seat at the table. "No, boys," he said softly, his voice betraying the sadness he tried to hide. "I didn't get the tree." Lucas and James exchanged a brief glance, their faces falling. It was a small thing they had asked for, a simple wish, but to Oliver it felt like an insurmountable mountain. They had never asked for much, but every year their hopes had been crushed. This year it was different. They had asked him, their father, for just one thing. Slowly they stood, their heads down, and went to their room without another word. Their small feet made no sound as they walked away. The house felt emptier than ever. Oliver sat there in silence, the weight of their disappointment heavy on his heart. He couldn't stop the tears that fell now. His children had tried so hard to understand their circumstances, but he could see it in their eyes, the pain, the longing, and the hopelessness. The clock ticked in the background, marking the seconds that stretched into hours. Oliver sat there, staring at the empty table, feeling more alone than ever. His mind wandered back to the past. Luna. Her name echoed in his mind like a distant memory, a reminder of everything he had lost. The pain of losing his wife, Luna, was something he could never quite shake. Their marriage had started out like any other, a union filled with hope and love. Oliver had been a proud man, confident in his place in the world, but Luna had seen something in him that he hadn't recognized in himself. She was everything he was not, fair, beautiful, and confident. They had been an unlikely pair, and the town had whispered about them, about the strange union between a dark-skinned man and a fair-skinned woman. But he had loved her. He had truly believed that love would bridge the gap between them, that it would conquer all. But the reality had been far different. Luna had married him for his wealth, not his love. Oliver had always been too blinded by his feelings for her to see it. She had used him, manipulated him, and in the end had taken everything from him, his money, his home, and his heart. When their children, Lucas and James, were born, things got worse. They were dark-skinned like Oliver, and Luna couldn't hide her disgust. When she first laid eyes on them, her face twisted in revulsion. "Why couldn't they look like me?" she had said in a sharp, cruel voice, her words searing into Oliver's soul. "No one will ever believe they're mine." The cracks in their relationship had deepened after that. Luna's friends would mock her behind her back, whispering about her dark-skinned children, and she grew bitter and angry. The love she had once feigned was gone, replaced by contempt, and Oliver, the man who had once loved her with all his heart, had watched as she slowly turned into someone he no longer recognized. Now, 2 years after the divorce, Oliver was left to raise his children alone. He had done his best, working long hours, taking on odd jobs, trying to make ends meet, but it was never enough. The whispers of the town still followed him, and his children bore the brunt of that cruelty. But what hurt the most was that despite everything, Luna had walked away. She had moved on to a new life, leaving him and their children behind. The bitterness in her heart had pushed her to abandon everything she had once claimed to love. As Oliver sat in the silence of his empty home, his thoughts returned to his children. They had no idea how much he loved them, how desperately he wished things could be different. They had no idea of the sacrifices he made, the pain he endured just to see them smile. Oliver wiped away his tears, standing up from the table. He looked around the small, dimly lit room, his heart heavy with regret. He had failed them, but as he thought about their bright eyes, their hope, a new resolve began to form within him. He couldn't give up, not now, not when they still believed in him. Oliver walked toward the door, his mind made up. He would keep his promise. He would find a way to make this Christmas special for his boys, even if it meant going without himself. Oliver sat in the small, dimly lit kitchen, the sound of the ticking clock on the wall growing louder in the silence. His thoughts felt disjointed, like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. He absent-mindedly wiped his hands on the ragged sleeve of his shirt, staring at the half-eaten bread on the table. It had been days since he had eaten properly. The hunger didn't seem to matter anymore. What mattered was the weight of everything. His failed marriage, the constant struggle to provide for his children, and the crushing realization that his life had come to a standstill. He thought about Luna, his wife. Luna, the woman he had once adored, who had seemed so perfect in his eyes. Her fair skin had been the first thing that had caught his attention when they had met. She had been elegant, refined, and carried herself with an air of sophistication that had drawn him in. For years he had believed that they were in love, that they had built something beautiful together, but over time the cracks in their relationship had deepened, cracks that he had been too blind to see. Luna had never loved him. She had never loved him for who he was. She had loved the life he could give her, the money, the status, the comforts that came with being married to a man of means. She had been cold, calculating, and when her true nature revealed itself, Oliver had been left devastated. 2 months ago, after the birth of their twin boys, Lucas and James, things had begun to unravel. Luna, so horrified by the fact that their children had inherited his dark skin, had shown her disgust in ways that were impossible to ignore. The first time Oliver had seen her look at the boys after their birth, the way her expression hardened and her lips twisted, he had felt a pang of betrayal. "I can't believe they came out like this," she had murmured, her voice filled with disdain. "How can they be mine?" Oliver, trying to defend his children, had been met with nothing but cruel remarks. It wasn't the first time he had been made to feel small in their marriage, but this time it stung deeper. Luna's rejection of their children, their own flesh and blood, was a blow he couldn't easily shake off. For months, Luna had grown more distant. She spent long hours out of the house, claiming she was handling business, while Oliver took care of the children as best he could. His pride had kept him from asking for help. He was determined to make things work, even if it meant doing it all alone. But Luna wasn't the same woman he had married. She was different, detached, indifferent to the family they had created. Oliver had worked hard, often late into the night, trying to keep up with bills and the cost of living, but his efforts were never enough to make Luna happy. It wasn't just his work ethic that fell short in her eyes. It was the color of his skin, the very thing that had once drawn her to him. The final blow came on an evening when Oliver's worst fears were realized. He had been out running errands, trying to make ends meet, when he stopped by a local restaurant to grab a quick bite. He had no idea that this was the moment that would change everything. As he walked into the restaurant, he saw Luna sitting at a table with a man, a tall, handsome businessman. Oliver's heart sank as he saw the way Luna was laughing with him, her hand resting on his arm, her face glowing with a kind of happiness he hadn't seen in years. The man was exactly the opposite of Oliver, well-dressed, confident, and clearly someone Luna could be proud of. Oliver's breath hitched. A wave of anger, humiliation, and betrayal rushed over him. How long had this been going on? How long had she been seeing this man behind his back? Was this the life she had always wanted? He couldn't take it anymore. He walked over to the table, his voice shaky but filled with emotion. "Luna," he said, his tone barely a whisper. "What is this? What's going on?" Luna looked up, her expression changing from one of warmth to one of coldness. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her eyes flashing with irritation. "I told you I was handling business. You shouldn't be here." Oliver looked at the businessman, his heart breaking. "Is this your business? Sitting here with another man?" Luna's lips curled into a cruel smile. "It's none of your business, Oliver. You're just a dark-skinned failure," she said, her voice cutting through him like a knife. "You've always been beneath me." Oliver stood frozen for a moment, unable to process her words. The sting of her rejection, her disgust, was more than he could bear. The betrayal, the humiliation, it all came crashing down on him. Without thinking, he raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the restaurant, drawing the attention of other patrons. Luna's face twisted in shock, but the anger in her eyes quickly turned to contempt. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You're nothing. Just a worthless, dark man. You never were good enough for me." Oliver's heart shattered into pieces. The man sitting across from Luna looked uncomfortable, but Luna was completely unbothered. She stood up, tossing her napkin onto the table. "I don't have time for this. You're embarrassing me," she said coldly, before walking out of the restaurant, the businessman trailing behind her. When Oliver returned home that night, it was to an empty house. Lucas and James were crying, their small faces streaked with tears. They were hungry, and Luna had left them alone, just as she always did. Oliver tried to comfort them, but his own tears fell silently as he held them in his arms. His heart ached for them. They didn't deserve this. They deserved a mother who loved them, who cared for them. But instead, they had a mother who had abandoned them, who had left them to suffer in the cold, alone. Oliver fed them the little food they had left, though it wasn't much. As he sat beside them, his mind replayed the events of the day. Luna's cold words, her betrayal, the slap he had given her. His head was spinning, and his chest felt tight with grief. He couldn't take it anymore. He knew that Luna was gone, and there was no coming back from this. She had made her choice, and it wasn't him. She had left him to pick up the pieces of their broken family. That night, as the children fell asleep in his arms, Oliver found himself crying like he never had before. His body shook with grief, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his despair. He thought about the life they could have had, the family they were supposed to be. He thought about how Luna had once promised him the world, but in the end, she had left him with nothing. Oliver couldn't help but wonder, how had it all gone so wrong? But as the darkness of the night settled around him, one thing became painfully clear. He was alone. And his children, his 2 boys, were all that mattered now. They were the only ones who had ever truly loved him, and for them he would keep fighting. He would keep going, even if it meant doing it alone. Oliver had always considered himself a man of pride, though that pride had slowly been chipped away over the years. It wasn't just the absence of his wife, Luna, or the burden of raising his 2 children alone. It was the constant struggle. Every day felt like a fight to keep his head above water, yet the weight of his responsibilities never seemed to lessen. One evening, as Oliver returned home after another long day of searching for work, he noticed something unsettling. It wasn't just the usual sound of children laughing and playing, the sounds of youth that had filled his home once upon a time. Today, it was different. His heart sank as he caught sight of his children standing on the sidewalk, their heads lowered, their shoulders hunched in a way that immediately caught his attention. There, in the distance, a group of children from the neighborhood was laughing at them. The words were cutting, harsh, and filled with the kind of cruelty only children could possess. "Look at them," one of the boys sneered, pointing at Lucas and James. "They look like the night sky. Why are they so dark? Did they fall into a chimney?" Another girl giggled, her face contorted with mockery. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from. Nobody wants to play with you. You're just like your father, ugly and poor." The laughter echoed in Oliver's ears, each word reverberating through his chest. His heart ached as he watched his sons' faces fall, their expressions turning to ones of deep sadness and confusion. They didn't understand why the other kids hated them. They didn't understand why their skin was a source of shame, something to be ridiculed. Oliver froze, his fists clenched, the anger rising in his throat. But he didn't act on it. He didn't say a word. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He didn't want his sons to see him react. He didn't want them to think that this was something they should fight against or even acknowledge. So he turned away, as if he hadn't heard anything at all. "Let's go inside," Oliver said quietly, trying to steady his voice. Lucas and James didn't protest. They had grown used to their father's silence, used to the way he shielded them from the ugliness of the world, even if it hurt him to do so. As they walked into the house, Oliver closed the door gently behind them, but the words from the children outside lingered in the air. His own heart felt heavy as he watched his sons go to their small room and sit in silence. They were old enough now, too old to not understand the sting of rejection. Over the next few weeks, Oliver's struggles deepened. His friends, those few who still tried to offer advice or comfort, had noticed how worn out he had become. They spoke to him with concern in their voices. "Oliver," one of them said one evening, pulling him aside in the street, "you're doing everything you can, but don't you think it's time to think about remarriage? The boys need a mother. You need help. It's hard to keep going like this. You can't do it all alone." Oliver had heard this advice many times before. He could see the concern in their eyes, but he couldn't shake the bitterness that surged inside him. How could he think about remarriage? What did he have to offer? His friends didn't understand. They didn't see the years of struggle that had drained him of all his energy. They didn't see the bags under his eyes, the weariness in his hands, the way his shoulders sagged from the constant weight of life. He had no money, no job, and no prospects. He could barely afford to feed his children, let alone think about marriage again. But his friends persisted, offering him names of widows and women they thought might be suitable. But Oliver never took any of their suggestions seriously. He had loved Luna once, and that love had turned to dust. He couldn't bear the thought of trusting another woman again, especially not for the sake of convenience. And so, he continued to struggle, waking up every morning to the same hopeless routine. Search for work, fail to find any, come home to an empty house, feed his children the little food they had, and try to make sure they still felt loved, even when everything around them screamed otherwise. As time passed, Oliver's situation became worse. The house, once a proud symbol of his family's prosperity, had fallen into disrepair. The walls were cracked, the windows dirty, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. It looked like something abandoned, something that no one cared for. The memories of the time when it had been the most beautiful house in town haunted him. He remembered the laughter, the warm light of the fireplace, the way Luna had smiled when she'd walked through the door with a fresh coat of paint. The house had once been filled with life, with promise, But now, it felt like a forgotten ruin, much like his own spirit. But Oliver refused to let himself fall completely. He thought of his children, the way they looked at him with those wide eyes, their trust and hope shining through despite everything. They didn't see the crumbling walls or the faded curtains. They only saw their father, and they trusted him. "One day, I'll make sure you have everything you need," Oliver promised himself every day, even when he wasn't sure how he would make that happen. But he couldn't give up now. Not when Lucas and James were counting on him. There were days when the hunger in their bellies seemed unbearable. He had nothing left to give them. Sometimes he would go to bed with an empty stomach, trying not to show his children that he was struggling. The guilt gnawed at him, but he had to be strong. He couldn't let them see him weak. Every Christmas, as December rolled around, his sons would talk about decorations, about the joy of seeing lights on the houses. It was a dream that Oliver couldn't fulfill. Every year, he promised them that next Christmas would be different. He would have a tree, he would have presents, he would make their dreams come true. But it never happened. And, as the years went by, the promises became harder to keep. The house, too, grew older. The paint peeled, the wood creaked, and the floors became uneven. It was as though the very walls were echoing his own feelings of defeat. But Oliver would push through. He had to. For Lucas and James. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, he would close his eyes and remember the days when this house had been full of life. It motivated him. He couldn't let them live in this brokenness forever. Not when he had known what it was like to have something better, something worth working for. One day, Oliver found himself standing in the living room, looking at the faded walls, the cracked window. He clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "I will never let you live in poverty. I will give you everything, no matter what it takes." It was a vow, a promise that he would carry with him every day as he struggled to find work, as he fought to keep his family together, and as he battled against the world that seemed to be against him at every turn. No matter what, he would never stop trying, because they were his children, and no matter how much the world tried to break him, he would never stop loving them. He would never give up. The next morning, Oliver awoke early, his body aching from exhaustion, yet the weight of responsibility pressing down harder than any physical fatigue. His two sons, Lucas and James, still slept soundly in the next room, their quiet breathing the only sound in the otherwise still house. Oliver stood at their doorway, looking at their innocent faces, the way they were curled up together under the thin blanket. His heart ached at the thought of how much they deserved more than what life had handed them. A wave of guilt washed over him. His children hadn't been to school in over a week, and the school had expelled them due to unpaid fees. The thought of their little faces, disappointed and confused, stung deeply. They didn't deserve to carry the burden of his failures. But today, he promised himself, would be different. Today, he would find work. Today, he would bring home some hope for them. He had to. He kissed their foreheads gently, making sure not to wake them. As he straightened, he whispered, "I'll be back soon. Don't worry, things will get better." Oliver grabbed his worn coat, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside, determined. His shoes scraped against the dirt path as he walked through the quiet town, passing houses that were well kept, their windows adorned with Christmas decorations. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of what he could not give his children. The bright lights of the holiday season mocked him, mocked his inability to provide. He went from one factory to another, the steps of his journey heavy and slow. The factory gates, the concrete walls, the empty promises that came with each polite rejection all blurred together. He was told, time and time again, that there were no positions available. Some were kind enough to listen to his story, but there was nothing they could do. Others dismissed him with a glance, a wave of the hand. It didn't matter how desperate he was, how much he needed a chance. He wasn't the kind of person they wanted in their factories. By midday, his stomach growled, and his legs ached, but he kept walking. His mind raced with thoughts of his children, his heart heavy with the image of their empty plates, their hopeful eyes waiting for a meal he couldn't afford. Every corner he turned, Every door he knocked on led to another dead end. But then, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, something changed. He passed a factory that looked different from the others. This one had a fresh coat of paint on the building, workers bustling in and out, their faces eager and hopeful. The gates were open, and the atmosphere was one of order and purpose. Oliver hesitated for a moment, watching the workers through the gates. Maybe this time, just maybe, it would be different. He walked up to the entrance, feeling a flicker of hope ignite within him. He could hear the noise of the machinery inside, the hum of industry. He had to at least try. A guard at the entrance looked him over, his eyes scanning Oliver's ragged clothes before giving a short nod. "Looking for work?" the guard asked, his tone neutral. Oliver nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, I need a job. I'll do anything." The guard studied him for a moment, then turned and motioned for him to follow. "Wait here," he said. "I'll call the manager." Oliver stood in the shadow of the factory, his heart racing, his palms sweating. He glanced around, watching the workers inside. They seemed so focused, so driven. Their lives were in stark contrast to his own. How had things become so difficult? How had he ended up here, asking for a chance? Minutes later, a man emerged from the factory, his footsteps brisk and assured. He was well dressed, his face sharp, but his eyes were calculating. Oliver's stomach twisted. The man's posture, the way he carried himself, it felt too familiar, and then it hit him. This was Eduardo Alvarez, the man who had once been his boss, the man who had ruined his life years ago. Eduardo was no longer just his former employer. He was now the husband of Luna, Oliver's ex-wife. He was the man who had taken everything from him, and now he stood in front of Oliver, his expression unreadable. Oliver's heart stopped. "Oliver," Eduardo said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I didn't expect to see you again. What's the matter? Looking for work?" Oliver's fists clenched at his sides. He had not expected to face Eduardo today, not like this, but here he was, standing in front of the man who had helped destroy his family, his home, his entire world. Eduardo had once been kind to him, once treated him like a friend, but now everything had changed. "I need work," Oliver said, his voice steady, though it shook with the weight of his emotions. "I've been to every factory in this town. I'll take anything you can offer." Eduardo looked Oliver up and down, his gaze calculating. "You're not really the type of person we're looking for," he said flatly, "but I'll give you a chance, if you want it. You can start in the warehouse, moving crates, cleaning up. It's hard work, and it's not glamorous, but it pays, and I can even offer you an advance, but you have to prove yourself first." Oliver stood frozen. He couldn't believe this was happening. Eduardo's words felt like a slap in the face. The man who had ruined his life was now offering him scraps, treating him as if he were beneath him. Oliver fought the urge to turn around and walk away. He fought the anger rising in his chest. He had come here for a job, not to beg for one from the man who had caused him so much pain. "No," Oliver said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I won't work for you. I won't accept charity from you." Eduardo's smirk faltered, but Oliver didn't wait for him to respond. He turned and walked out of the factory, out into the cold air of the street, not looking back. He didn't need this job, not if it meant giving up his dignity, not if it meant accepting Eduardo's pity. As Oliver walked, his mind raced. How would he explain this to his children? He had promised them he would find work. He had promised them things would get better. How could he face them now? How could he tell them that yet again he had failed them? But as he walked down the street, something caught his eye. A small object, something gleaming in the corner of his vision. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to it. He turned his head and his eyes fixed on it, a discarded object, lying in an abandoned lot. It was hard to make out from a distance, but there was something familiar about it. Oliver slowed his pace, his heart pounding. What was it? And why did it suddenly feel so important? He took a few more steps toward it, his gaze locked on the object, but he stopped short before reaching it. Something in his gut told him that he wasn't ready to face whatever lay ahead. Not yet. With a final, weary sigh, Oliver turned away and continued his walk home, the weight of the world still heavy on his shoulders. The chill of the evening was sharp, slicing through the air like 1,000 tiny needles. The town was alive with the bright flicker of Christmas lights, casting their warm glow on houses that were brimming with festive cheer. Laughter filled the air as families huddled around their Christmas trees, children excitedly waiting for the magic of the season to unfold. But in Oliver's home there was nothing but silence, only the soft murmur of wind against the cracked walls. Inside, Lucas and James sat cross-legged on the floor, their small faces full of excitement. Their eyes darted toward the window, gazing at the decorated houses across the street. They didn't know how much their father had sacrificed, how many promises he had made and failed to keep. All they knew was that tonight their father had promised them a Christmas tree, and despite the hardships, their hearts brimmed with hope. "Papa promised," Lucas said with shining eyes, his voice full of expectation. He jumped up and pulled on James's sleeve. "He said we would have a Christmas tree this year, just like the one in the neighbor's house." James's face broke into a smile. "Yes, Papa will bring it. We'll have lights and ornaments, and maybe even candy." Their voices were full of innocence and joy, the purest form of love a child could have for their father. They didn't see the cracks in the walls, the dim light in the room, or the emptiness that lingered in the air. All they saw was hope, a hope they trusted their father would fulfill. But Oliver, far from home, was struggling. His hands were empty, his pockets devoid of even the smallest coin. He had been to every factory in town knocking on doors, pleading for work, only to be turned away each time. The factory doors had slammed shut in his face, one after the other. His heart grew heavier with every step he took. No work, no money, no way to make his children's Christmas wish come true. He had promised them the tree, but now, as the evening grew colder, he could only feel the crushing weight of failure pressing down on him. He tried not to think about it, tried not to imagine their disappointed faces when he returned home empty-handed, but it was impossible. Every step felt like a step further away from his promise, from the future he had wanted for them. His mind kept returning to the image of their faces, their shining eyes filled with hope. How could he tell them that this year they wouldn't have a Christmas tree? How could he explain that he wasn't enough, that he couldn't even provide the simplest of joys for them? Oliver stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath. The air was cold, biting at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold inside him. He wanted to believe that he could do better. He wanted to believe that somehow, some miracle would come through. But as he stood there, with nothing but the empty streets and his failed attempts behind him, he couldn't help but wonder if he was destined to always let them down. That was when he saw it. His eyes caught the faint outline of something among the scattered debris of a nearby alley, a figure half hidden beneath the layers of trash. He hesitated, wondering if it was real, but as he took a step closer, the shape came into clearer view. It was a Christmas tree. At first, Oliver thought it was just an illusion, perhaps something he had imagined in his exhaustion. But no, as he walked closer, the reality set in. There it was, discarded in the trash, covered in dirt and debris. It was large, but its needles were dry and brittle. The ornaments were either missing or broken, and the tangle of lights seemed like they hadn't been used in years. It was old, forgotten, and in every way imperfect. But it was a Christmas tree. Oliver's heart skipped a beat. He looked around the empty street, ensuring no one was watching. There was no one in sight, no one who could judge him for what he was about to do. He quickly moved to the tree, pulling it from the pile of refuse, his hands trembling as he grasped the dry, brittle branches. The smell of decay filled the air, but he didn't care. This was his only chance. He stood there for a moment, holding the tree, not sure what to do next. Could he bring this whole neglected thing home? Could he really take it back to his children, knowing it was far from perfect? Would they laugh at it? Would they feel disappointed? But no, a surge of determination coursed through him. He had promised them a Christmas tree, and by God he would give them one. He grabbed the tree by its trunk, struggling to balance it in his arms. The odor lingered, but he ignored it, focusing on the prize in his arms. As he walked back toward his house, his heart beat faster, the hope of fulfilling his promise starting to kindle again. For the first time all day, he felt a tiny flicker of hope, as fragile as the tree he carried. But as Oliver walked down the street, carrying the tree with a quiet sense of pride, he began to notice something. A few people walking by stopped to look at him. Some of them snickered, their whispers harsh as they pointed at the shabby tree in his arms. "Look at him. What is that, a Christmas tree or a pile of trash?" one of them sneered. Oliver felt the sting of their words, but he refused to let it show. He kept his head down, his shoulders slumped as he continued walking. His hands gripped the tree tighter, but the mockery of the townspeople echoed in his ears. He wanted to turn around, to tell them that it didn't matter, that he was doing this for his children, for the promise he had made, but instead, he just pressed on, his pace quickening, his heart pounding with a mix of sadness and determination. When he finally reached his home, his feet were sore and his heart heavy. He was exhausted, drained of energy, but he didn't care. His children were waiting for him. As soon as the door creaked open, Lucas and James jumped to their feet, their eyes wide with excitement. "Papa, you really brought it! You really got the tree!" Lucas's voice was filled with disbelief, his words tumbling out in a rush. James ran to Oliver, his face beaming. "It's here! It's really here! We have a Christmas tree!" Oliver smiled weakly, trying to hide his exhaustion. He placed the tree down carefully in the corner of the room, trying his best to straighten the branches, but it was clear to see. The tree was far from perfect. It was crooked, the needles were sparse, and it was missing lights and decorations. But for Lucas and James, it was the most beautiful tree they had ever seen. "Can we decorate it now, Papa?" James asked eagerly, bouncing up and down on his feet. Lucas grabbed his brother's hand. "Yes, let's put the lights on and hang the ornaments. It's our tree, Papa." Oliver stood there, watching them, his heart swelling with emotion. He hadn't brought them the perfect tree. It wasn't the beautiful sparkling tree that he had imagined for them, but as he looked at their faces, those shining eyes full of love and joy, he knew something. It didn't matter that the tree was broken or old or discarded. What mattered was that he had kept his promise. And in that moment, the love and happiness in his children's eyes made the tree shine brighter than anything else. And little did Oliver know, this simple forgotten tree, the one that had been thrown away and abandoned by the world, was about to change his life forever. The Christmas tree stood in the center of their modest living room, its mismatched lights flickering softly. Some of the lights were bright, while others struggled to stay on, casting an uneven glow across the room. Oliver stepped back, his heart heavy, yet filled with a strange kind of pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, his children's Christmas miracle, even if it hadn't quite unfolded the way he had dreamed. His mind, however, didn't allow him to relax. The children, Lucas and James, were still buzzing with excitement. They could hardly sit still, eager to see the final touches. It was already dark outside, and the winter chill had begun to set in, but they wanted their tree to shine, to bring a little piece of magic to their home. With a sigh, Oliver walked to the door, feeling a pang of guilt. He'd forgotten the lights, proper Christmas lights to give the tree that final touch of festivity. He had thought of everything else, from the tree to the snowman they'd built earlier, but in his exhaustion, he had neglected the one thing that would complete the picture. But he wasn't going to let that ruin their Christmas. "I'll be back in a minute, boys," he whispered, though they were already too excited to hear him. He grabbed the torch and stepped outside into the cold night, his footsteps heavy in the snow. The town was quiet, the streets empty, and the silence pressed down on him like a thick blanket. The crisp air stung his skin, but his heart raced with determination. He was going to find those lights, even if it meant walking the streets all night. His children deserved this. They deserved more than he could give, but tonight, he would give them what he could. As Oliver walked down the dimly lit street, his mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. It had been such a struggle, every day a battle against time, against his own exhaustion. His children's smiles had kept him going, even as they faced ridicule from others, even as the cold and hunger gnawed at his own body. But now, the only thing that mattered was getting those lights. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, Oliver's eyes caught a glimmer in the distance. It wasn't the warm glow of a store sign or the festive lights of a shop, it was something else. As he neared the local trash bin by the alley, something caught his eye. The pile of discarded items, covered in snow and ice, held an odd, unfamiliar shape. Intrigued, Oliver moved closer. There, half buried under a pile of wrappers and food scraps, was a string of Christmas lights, old, frayed, and tangled, but still glowing. The bulbs flickered in the darkness, some of them bright, others barely visible. It wasn't the perfect set he had imagined, but in that moment it was enough. It was all he had. His heart skipped a beat as he reached out, carefully pulling the lights free from the trash. The scent of decay and wet paper filled his nostrils, but he didn't care. He couldn't. For his children, he would do anything, even if it meant scavenging through trash. He took the lights and started his walk back home, every step feeling heavier with the weight of the world on his shoulders. The snow crunched beneath his boots and the cold bit into his skin, but he didn't mind. Tonight, the lights would shine on their tree. Tonight, he would make sure his children had something to believe in. As he walked back into the house, he saw the glow of the tree through the window. The children were sitting by the tree, their small faces illuminated by the flickering light. They looked so full of hope, so full of joy. Oliver's throat tightened as he watched them, wishing he could give them more, wishing he could make everything perfect for them. Inside, the smell of the small fire he had lit in the hearth warmed the room, but the weight of the Christmas tree with its mismatched, faint lights made everything feel colder. The glow didn't quite reach the edges of the room, leaving shadows that seemed to swallow the corners. Still, it was all they had. "Papa! Papa, you're back!" Lucas shouted excitedly, his voice filled with childlike innocence. James jumped up from the floor, clapping his hands. "The tree looks amazing, Papa," he said with wide eyes, his excitement contagious. Oliver smiled at them, but he couldn't shake the weight in his heart. "I brought the lights," he said softly, placing the string of lights on the table before them. The boys scrambled to their feet, eager to help. They all sat around the tree as Oliver carefully untangled the lights and draped them across the branches. Some flickered, others glowed brightly, and a few remained stubbornly dark. But for the children, it was perfect. To them, the tree was magic, the lights were shining, and their father was the hero who had made it all happen. Their laughter filled the air as they added the final touches, small ornaments they had found or made over the years. The snowman, now standing proudly by the window, seemed to smile at them in approval. Oliver watched his children, feeling a swelling in his chest. Despite everything, despite the poverty, the struggles, the pain, his children were happy, and that was enough. For tonight, that was all that mattered. The evening wore on, and as midnight approached, the children slowly began to tire. Their eyes fluttered as they lay down beside the tree, gazing at the lights one last time before sleep claimed them. Oliver kissed them both good night, brushing his fingers through their hair as they drifted off to sleep. He sat quietly by the window, watching the flickering lights on the tree. A wave of exhaustion swept over him, but he didn't want to sleep. He wanted to hold on to this moment, this small miracle that had taken all he had to give. As he stared at the tree, a sudden noise broke the stillness of the night. At first, it was barely a whisper, like the sound of a soft breeze. Then, it grew louder, rustling, scraping, and then a thud. Oliver's heart jolted. His eyes shot to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the door handle. He knew he had to check, knew that something had disturbed the quiet of their little home. He stood up quickly, his legs stiff from sitting too long. As he stepped toward the door, he glanced back at the children, still sound asleep, their breathing steady and peaceful. With a deep breath, Oliver opened the door just a crack and peeked outside. There, lying near the tree, was a black polythene bag. He didn't know what to expect. It could have been trash, discarded carelessly by someone else, but when he stepped closer and nudged it with his foot, it was strangely heavy. His heart began to pound in his chest. With trembling hands, he opened the bag. Inside, there was a large stack of money, enough to change everything. And, as if that wasn't miraculous enough, there was a note. This gift is from Santa Claus to a person with a beautiful heart, who truly deserves it. Oliver's mind went blank. His hands shook as he read the note again, and his heart thundered in his chest. Was this real? Was this some kind of cruel joke, or was it a miracle? The children stirred in their sleep, but Oliver remained rooted to the spot, staring at the money in disbelief. Tears welled up in his eyes. It wasn't Santa Claus, of course. It was someone who had seen their struggle and had chosen to help, anonymously. A kind-hearted person who understood that the holiday wasn't about what you had, but about love, kindness, and family. Oliver's voice caught in his throat as he whispered, "Thank you from the bottom of my heart." He took the money inside, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. This Christmas would be different. He would make sure of it. With this unexpected gift, he could finally give his children the Christmas they deserved. The tree would shine brighter, and their home would be full of laughter, warmth, and hope. And as for the money, it would go towards fixing their house, for giving them the Christmas they had dreamed of, and for building a future where they didn't have to scrape by day after day. But tonight, as Oliver stood in the doorway looking at the Christmas tree, his heart full of gratitude and hope, he knew that what mattered most was not the money, the lights, or even the tree. It was the love he shared with his children. That, after all, was the true miracle of Christmas.